This video tutorial I will explain web service endpoint for get a single address details for a specific user, and it is an example of one-to-many relationship. Here you can see users table. It has user related columns, and here you can see addresses table. It has addresses related columns, and primary key of users table is linked with addresses as a foreign key, and one user can have n number of addresses. Now we will see the example. Here you can see users table. It has 4 records, and here you can see addresses table, and it has addresses related to users in the users table, and primary key of user is linked in addresses table as a foreign key. For Arun, there are 2 addresses are there. For Peter, there are 2 addresses are there. And in this example, we will see passing this public user ID and passing this public address ID, how to get the address details. Here you can see user controller class. It has get user address method which accept user ID and address ID. To call this method, we have to use HTTP method as get and send request to this URL. Here path parameter is user ID and address ID. Path parameter user ID value will be assigned to this one, and path parameter address ID value will be assigned to this one. And this method returns addresses REST, and this method produces either JSON or XML. Here I am creating addresses REST object and initializing to null. Then I am calling get address method of address service object and passing user ID and address ID. User ID is public user ID and address ID is public address ID. This method returns address DTO object, and if address DTO object is not null, I am creating a model mapper object, and using map method of model mapper object, I am copying address DTO property values to addresses REST. Then I am returning addresses REST to the caller. Now we will see addresses REST class. It has addresses related properties. Next we will see address DTO class. It has address related properties. Next we will see address service interface. Here you can see address service interface, and it has get address method which accept user ID and address ID, and this method is abstract method. Implementation of this method is there in address service impl. And here you can see address service impl class which implements address service interface and provide implementation of get address method which accept user ID and address ID. Here I am creating address DTO object and initializing to null. Then I am calling find by user ID method of user repository object and passing user ID. This method returns user entity object. Then I am calling find by user details and address ID method of address repository object and passing user entity and address ID. This method returns address entity object. If address entity object is not null, then I am creating a model mapper object, and using map method of model mapper object, I am copying address entity property values to address DTO, and then here I am returning address DTO object to the controller. Now we will see user entity class. And here you can see user entity class, and which is mapped to users table, and it has user related properties, and it has a list of address entity. And here you can see address entity class, which is mapped to addresses table, and it has addresses related properties. Next we will see user repository interface. Here you can see user repository interface, and it is responsible for CRUD operation related to users table. Next we will see address repository interface, and it is responsible for addresses related CRUD operations. Now I will start the application in debug mode. Now I am going to send request to login URL to get public user ID and JWT token for the user Arun. And in the body I am passing email and password. Click on send. And here we got 200 OK, so it is successful. Click on headers, and it is response headers. And here we got public user ID. Copy this. This is the URL we have to use to get address detail of the particular user. So here paste that public user ID, and copy this JWT token, and in request header and in authorization header paste that. Then we have to get public address ID also. Go to the database, and for user Arun there are two records are there. I am taking one of the public address ID. Copy this, paste it here, click on send. Request reached here. Here we got the output, and we got specific address details related to the particular user. Now I will give wrong public address ID. I will change to some invalid public address ID. Click on send. And here we got 200 OK as a status, and we did not get any output because for this particular public address ID there is no record in the database. You can get Java source code link for each video in the description section of the video. Here you can see the description section. Click on show more, and here you can see the Java source code links. Click on these links to get the Java source code.